A warm welcome to all of you that have signed up to attend this webinar on evidence-based approach to science communication. And Dr. Chris Volpe from ScienceCounts is going to be talking to us based on his extensive research experience on understanding audiences' perceptions about science today. So the way we will conduct this webinar is Dr. Volpe will talk to us for about 30 minutes. It's going to be a presentation followed by question and answers. And what I'm going to request all of our awesome attendees is that you type your questions in the chat window, and I will start to compile them and then pass it on to Dr. Volpe to respond to those questions. Yes? With that, over to Dr. Volpe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Radha. I want to thank everybody for carving time out of your Friday afternoon to spend some time with us. And I certainly hope that I'll make it a good use of your time. My name is Chris Volpe. I'm the Executive Director of ScienceCounts. ScienceCounts is a nonprofit that formed about 4 years ago with the mission to bolster public support for science. And I'll tell you a little bit about the organization myself in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to share my intention. I mean, one of the principles of good communication is know thy audience. And being that this is a webinar, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I don't know my audience very well. So in planning this conversation, I'm really going to cast a wide net. We're going to go relatively superficially through several things. And I just want to encourage everyone who wants to dig a little more deeply in certain areas to do so in the Q&A session, which we've allotted at least 30 minutes for. So I'm going to do a little bit of a survey here. First, just in terms of the mechanics of science communication that might be useful for newcomers. Folks who've been doing this for a while probably know this already. But then also I certainly want to share some of our recent insights into how the public looks and internalizes science. Because there's some actually relatively jarring results there as someone who is sort of a trained scientist myself. Okay, so we'll jump right in. So we live in a cynical age where the message is usually judged by by who's delivering the message, the messenger themselves. So let me provide you a little bit of background in terms of ScienceCounts and then about myself as the messenger here. ScienceCounts is an organization that really the idea for which came about during the 2012 World Science Festival, where the American Physical Society brought together a who's who of sort of mainstream science communicators. And this was an image taken at that meeting. And you'll see some familiar faces. There's Alan Alda on the far left. You'll see Neil deGrasse Tyson. Next to him is Ira Flatow from Science Fridays. A lot of other faces there. Folks who spent a lot of time bridging the gap between the scientific community and the public. And at this meeting, these folks were, the question was posed, how are you feeling about how effectively the scientific community is communicating, not just one way, but as a dialogue with the general public? And the consensus was not too well. So the ScienceCounts came about as an organization to focus solely on improving the communication, and that means both speaking and listening with the general public. As the executive director, my background is I am a trained scientist. I have a doctorate in atmospheric chemistry from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. But instead of pursuing an academic career, I became a bit of a small-scale serial entrepreneur. And so for the last 20 years, I really have been more of a professional marketer than I've been a scientist. And that makes some science folks cringe, but believe it or not, the scientific method and the marketing method are remarkably similar. They just use different languages. Observe, conceive, test, and evaluate. That's what good scientists do, and that's what good marketers do. And so I'm going to use terminologies from both areas here because I think a lot can be done by borrowing from conventional marketing techniques and bring them into science communication and as opposed to reinventing the wheel. Okay. So any form of communication, science or otherwise, there's two fundamental rules, two golden rules. The first is know thy audience. And what that means in English is, you know, you'd be wise to know what's important to the folks that you're talking about and what they care about. And then the other is know thyself. And know thyself actually has two facets. The first is, what are you trying to accomplish in this interaction? What's your objective? And your objective may be that there is no objective, and that's okay. You just want to be conscious of that. But the one that's often forgotten is, how are you perceived by your audience? Because it's a fact of existence that what we say and what people hear are often different. And so it's really important to understand how people see you, how are they branding you, because that will affect what they hear versus what you say, okay? So a little bit more about these know thys, to make them a little bit more mechanical as almost a how-to. So know thy audience, we just want to acknowledge that there are lots of different audiences we could be engaging. Here's a list of 5, there are many more, and you certainly could break these down further. Peers, administrators, funders, policymakers, public, these are ones that a typical scientist would you know, probably engage with. The one that I and ScienceCounts are especially interested in is the public audience. So much of the data that I will share later has to do with the general public. And then in terms of know thyself, this is a place where you can go really wrong, really badly. And the scientific community broadly has had a hard time with this one. So this might be useful, I hope, to some of us. One needs to realize that the term science communication is a bit of a messy term. It's really an umbrella term. It's kind of a catch-all. And it's a family of specific communication activities, each of which has a specific desired outcome. So what you see here is, hey, if I want to boost literacy, scientific literacy, I want to engage in science education. Science outreach boosts general awareness. Journalism, the job is to inform. And if you want to persuade someone, you want to change their mind, that you want to engage in something called advocacy. And so as you develop your communication strategy, you want to make sure that you match the correct activity to the correct desired outcome. And this isn't necessarily rocket science, but we seem to kind of get it wrong a lot as a community. And let me show you some actual data of where it can go right and where it can go wrong. So let's just focus on, hey, if my goal is to boost scientific literacy, so I'll just call that knowledge, then I engage in science education. And so a study was done by Dan Kahan and others earlier this decade, and it's actually a series of studies. And so I want to give you an example of kind of the case that works. So let's pose a question. What gas do scientists believe causes temperatures in the atmosphere to rise? So this is sort of a one-dimensional, factual, technical question. And I'm going to show a plot here in a second, but on the axis you have down at the bottom, general science literacy increasing to the right. Now this is actually a thing. There's a National Science Foundation science literacy test that you can give folks. So that's what the x-axis is here, is how people do on that general science literacy exam or assessment. And then how often they get the answer to this particular question correctly. And before we put up the chart, you would imagine as general science literacy goes up, you would hope in some sense the frequency of correct answers to this question would go up. And so you would see a chart kind of going up and to the right. And in fact, that's exactly what you see. And here, Kahan and crew split out liberals, Democrats, conservatives, Republicans, because it is a fact, as we will see later, that one's political ideology is usually the primary determinant in how one views one of these sort of controversial scientific issues or topics. Okay? So this is a good case, you know, one leads directly to the other. A case where it doesn't work, and climate messaging actually has been very susceptible to this. And that is, many of us in the climate community have tried to change people's position on climate change by educating them, by giving folks data, by figuring that if only you knew what I knew, you'd come around and acknowledge the fact that anthropogenic climate change is real. Well, the problem is fundamentally that is the wrong strategy. You don't change minds by filling people's heads with data. Or certainly that's the long, long way to do it. And so Kahan and team looked at this, and here's a little bit more complex question. Is there solid evidence of global warming due to human activities such as burning fossil fuels? Again, we're going to plot people. The correct answer here is acknowledging the scientific consensus, which is that the answer is yes, versus people's scientific literacy. And you might expect that this would go up and to the right, and in fact, it doesn't. In fact, you get a bifurcation, you get a divergence. The more science literate your audience is, the more they polarize. And for many, this is a shocking result, but it's not necessarily a surprising result based on first principles. Okay, and what's going on here, if you're wondering why this happens, is that people actually use their scientific knowledge to defend their position on an issue, not necessarily reach it. And that's a very human characteristic. In a busy world, we often reach a conclusion first based on intuition or based on what someone else trusts us, that we trust, who's a credible source. And then subsequent to that, at least for a while, we sort of we cherry pick facts and figures to defend that position. Okay, so this is a classic example of mismatching a communication activity with a desired outcome. All right. So now I want to sort of lay down some facts and possibly eliminate some myths in terms of public attitudes towards science. The first myth is that the public, sort of likes science, but not really. And we need to get out there and get the public to like science more, or certainly more of the public to like science. And unfortunately, that's a myth, or fortunately, that's a myth. The fact is, every indicator of the last 40 years shows that Americans overwhelmingly think science is a net good thing. The problem is not that a lot of Americans don't think science is a good thing, okay? We don't know why or how. There's a lot of unanswered questions, but generally speaking, the battle does not need to be fought to turn people onto science in a general sense. Another concern that many science communicators have is about trust. The fact is that certainly in the last few years, trust in scientists is eroding. Well, the fact is that there's no indication that that's happening in a comprehensive way. And what I have here is data from Pew, which goes back also 40 plus years, 45 years, and it shows, public trust in various professions and institutions. And generally, over the last 40 years, trust in almost everything has gone down as Americans have become more cynical about almost every institution, with two exceptions. One, scientists have generally held flat, which is great news. And then the other is actually the military. And military is interesting because if you look at the peaks in the military, you will see that those correspond with the first Gulf War and then post 9/11. So as scientists, we're doing pretty well. Now, I will say there is data that shows that trust in the institutions that employ scientists may be eroding, but trust in scientists as individuals is holding strong. So what I mean by the first statement is, if I'm a conservative, my trust in academic institutions, certainly the prestigious ones like the Harvards and the Berkeleys, is eroding for other reasons. If I am a liberal, my trust in corporations in the private sector, generally speaking, has eroded in the last 30 or 40 years. But it's not the scientists themselves. Okay. Now I want to get into talking about some ScienceCounts data. What we wanted to do first was to understand the why. When you say science to someone, what do they think? What do they feel? This is, in essence, as a marketer, this is a branding question. For example, if I say cactus, I'm going to guess that most of us think green. We maybe feel warmer than we feel colder. We might feel prickly. You might be thinking about a geographic area of the country or the world. Okay, that's what branding means in the context that I'm going to use it. Branding is that first cognitive, emotional, and sensory reflex to an idea or a word. okay? Because that's the initial starting point of a conversation. So when we say science on a crowded bus, what do people think? What do they feel? What do they see? What do they hear? Okay, and the answer is we really didn't know prior to this work. So the first thing you do is word association. And you test words and see how well they associate or don't associate with the word science. And so after doing a survey, and let me say our first work was a national survey, 2,000 participants. It was the highest resolution survey ever done on the issue of science and public attitudes. We found that words that the public positively associates with science are discovery, curiosity, invention, optimism, youth. So you could say sort of aspirational terms. Other terms that we tested that failed miserably were somewhat more pragmatic or CPA-like terms: investment, competition, budget, funding, grant, which funny enough are often the words that professional science societies use and other institutions use to the public. And again, we're focusing on the public, not policymakers per se here, but are often the terms we use to justify investments of federal dollars in science. Okay, so it's clear from the get-go that that the public is thinking about science in an aspirational way, not in a very sort of nuts and bolts pragmatic way. Okay, we did a series of other tests and probes and questions, and I want to get to the punchline because of shortness of time. And I'm here to tell you that we feel pretty confidently that when we say science, the majority of the general public hears the word hope. Hope is the brand of science. Okay, science and hope are synonyms in the lexicon of the general public. And that is a bit jarring to some of us, because I will tell you, as a scientist, myself, I might or might not use the word hope. Other words come to mind, like evidence or curiosity, kind of more intellectual terms. But then again, we as scientists are a self-selecting group. We are not representative of the general public, and we have to remember that when we decide to rely on our own personal experience and intuition. Okay? Now, this is profound, because once you understand your brand, everything else as far as messaging and communication should flow from that. So what are some of the ramifications of this? Well, first, hope is a terrific brand. I could imagine a lot worse ones to have. But the challenge is that the word hope itself is actually a placeholder. It's not the end of the branding journey, because different people hope for different things. So to say science is hope is great, but what you hope for and what I hope for, in other words, the desired outcomes, may be very different. So right there, that means that we have to get in the weeds a little bit, and we can't treat the public as one big amorphous glob. We have to actually get into various slivers and segments of the public that have certain specific worldviews and understand what they're hoping for, and then how science lays on that. So I want to share some data, and let me walk you through this, because this can be a bit confusing and a bit complicated, because it's actually showing multiple variables simultaneously. What you see here are the responses to the question, which of the following issues should be an urgent focus of scientific research? So the response is, should absolutely be a high priority or not so much. And on the first issue we're looking at here is the environment. What we've done is we've stratified liberals, moderates, and conservatives. So everything, the data is not just laying on top of itself and it's making a big mess. You'll see that the percentage that thinks it's a high or urgent priority goes from 0 up to the right. Okay, so generally speaking here, you see that liberals feel that the environment is a much, much higher priority for science, and of course, really in general, than conservatives. But the extra dimension that this chart shows is fine structure with respect to the effects of social economic status and education. So that's what the polygons are. We have now split out people, I'll look at liberals for a second, based on college or more, some college, or high school education or less. Now, to save you some aggravation from having to constantly go back between the chart and the key, let me give you a tip. The more sides a polygon has, the more years of formal education you have. So squares have 4 sides, triangles have 3 sides, circles have 1 side for the sake of this data. So just keep that in mind. That might save you from having to go back and forth. So what we see here with the environment is that you can see, a clear difference between liberals, conservatives, moderates, or somewhat the average, but there's not a strong difference or effect or correlation with one's education on this issue. I'll give you another issue with, how urgent is science with regards to national defense or national defense as an outcome of science? Well, this is somewhat the reciprocal, not surprising. Conservatives feel more strongly about national defense generally, and so science is, is a means to achieving that, so it correlates here. Liberals, again, less so, moderates in the middle, but you can see that, in fact, there's a little bit of separation or fine structure with respect to one's education, where the more educated you are, the less intensely you feel about the role in national defense. Okay, important stuff to know when you want to know thy audience. I want to look at just a couple of more. And let me say, we have dozens of these because you have to have dozens of these, but I picked ones that are somewhat kind of unique from one another. When it comes to the role of science in helping the disabled, this is an interesting one because this is one of the few examples where political ideology has no net effect, where all that really matters is your socioeconomic standing. And so here you see that folks who have less formal education feel more strongly about the role of science in helping the disabled than those who have more. And, one can speculate, and it's speculation, that if you're working with a forklift, you're more concerned about getting disabled than if you're sitting in front of a keyboard all day. Okay, so again, good to know. And then just the last example that I want to show is the go-to for science communicators, right? If you were to conduct a poll on the street and said, why does science matter? I'm willing to bet that 90% of the answers you receive have to do with how it cures disease or it helps sick people or it improves our health. And you can see here clearly that health and medicine, and this is unique, is the one issue where everyone feels very strongly about the role of science in improving health and medicine. Okay. So let me sort of begin to wrap this up with some take-home points. Many of us want to engage the public, or at least segments of the public, in a way that helps those segments appreciate the value of science in our society. But before we do that, I think there's some things that we, and I'm going to speak for the community of science communicators, need to do to change our perspective. So sort of change starts with us before we expect others to change. And there are 3 things that I want to cite. The first is we have to realize that the real world is not a classroom. The real world is a marketplace. Okay, we are not standing in front of a group of eager students who want to cling to our every word. The reality is that we are existing in a busy, busy space where we're competing with people's attention and priorities. And in the marketplace picture, let me say, of course, we're not the folks who are walking the aisles. We're the shelf stockers. We're the ones who have to put things on the shelves that get the general public to reach out and choose to opt in. I mean, this is one of the great lessons of the last 30 years of climate communication. We can't force, you cannot push a change of opinion on people. You can't even legislate it. There's plenty of examples of that, prohibition, drugs, etc. What we have to do is do what, in essence, marketers do, which is create an environment where people choose, they opt in to want to make that choice or change. And that is a fundamental change in perspective. The second is I'm here to tell you, and I really look forward to questions about this, that the brand of science is hope. But again, hope for what? And so you have to get into the weeds. This means that it's incumbent on us as communicators to connect the dots for the public. In other words, we have to show the benefits, especially the personal benefits of science to individuals. If we don't show how science is relevant to them in a personal way, our data and the data of others show that you don't get anywhere. And I like this image because I think it speaks to what we're talking about here. If you saw a can of food that said, generic, that just said food on it on a store shelf, I think most of us wouldn't be, too sure about buying that. And that's what you get if you give messages, pro-science messages that are at a too high a level or too generic. They really have to be sculpted to specific individuals and groups of individuals. And then finally, and this is sort of at the stratospheric strategic level for science institutions, and I'm fortunate enough to have conversations with some folks in that world as well. The fact is that one of the problems that we face as a community is we don't know what the dream is. You hear a lot about, well, we need more funding for science. Okay, I can get my hands around that. But of course, that's not really the dream. We want more money for science because we want that money to then do something. And what that do something is actually boost the scientific enterprise to make more science. It's a supply side dream, right? If I want more bicycles to come out of a factory, what do? I put in more workers, I put in more parts, and if I can, build more factories. That's a relatively straightforward problem. But you'll also hear folks, especially in the last 2 years, say that, gosh, I feel like, science isn't being incorporated into important societal decisions like it should. And that's what I mean when I say boost science's social impact, positive social impact. And as a marketer, that's actually, and as an economist would say this as well, that's a demand side problem. You can't force people, you can't force your next door neighbor who's somewhat agnostic to science to suddenly care about science. What we have to do is we have to make a value proposition. We have to connect, lay out a clear benefit, and then trust and leave it up to them to opt in and want and to increase their sort of desire for more science because they see it as a beneficial resource. And that's a demand side challenge. And the fact is, supply side and demand side issues and tactics are different. And I'm here to tell you that for the most part, the scientific community hasn't quite come up with a taxonomy for this yet. They're still lumping both together. And so we're somewhat feeling our way in the dark and confusing ourselves and misappropriating various tactics to various goals. And so this, I think, would be a positive step forward. Okay, well, with that, I think finished my brief survey. I just want to acknowledge the groups, scientific philanthropies, scientific societies, a couple of industrial partners, Elsevier Johnson & Johnson, some academic partners who've really helped us do the work we've done in the last 3 years as we're again, trying to better understand, under the skin, what's going on in people's hearts and minds when it comes to science so that we can more effectively connect with them and make clear the benefits to their lives of science, both as a process and also the products it produces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great presentation and we got a few questions. So Chris, if you just look at your chat window, you must have received the bottom of your screen. There's a chat window.
Okay.
And there are 7 questions there.
Just bear with me.
Yes. And we're getting more questions. Hold on. Okay. How to public? Okay.
And Radha, I'm working on that, but just for the sake of time, if you don't mind, if you could narrate the first couple until I get them up, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
One of the first questions is, would it be useful for scientists to take marketing courses to bolster our communication skills?
Yes, it would, but I think it'd actually be even more useful for scientists to take science communication courses, which exist now. And this is going to sound somewhat self-serving for my friends at the Alda Center, but that's what the Alda Center is all about, is to bring in communication and tools for marketing without any bias, acting tools. This is what Alan Alda is, this is his unique contribution to the space, improv tools, general communication tools in terms of how to be sensitive to the questions to ask, how to be a better listener, which is key, and then how to use that going forward. So it would be good to have marketing classes. It would be even better to have a well-designed science communication experience.
Okay, wonderful. So the next question is, how do the definitions of science communication activities, education, outreach, journalism, advocacy, etc., align to the mission of ScienceCounts, which is to bolster public support for science?
Great question. So my mission, my organization's mission, is to bolster public support and awareness for science, which is persuasion. And I'm not afraid of that word. Persuasion is not a bad thing. Many of us think it's a bad thing. It's not. If you're trying to persuade someone to quit smoking, that's a good thing. So we are squarely in the advocacy branch, if you will. Let me just say, if there's any listeners here who are professional advocates, the word advocacy is one of these messy words to people in Washington, D.C. or state capitals. It means lobbying. We're not lobbyists. We're not engaging policymakers. We're very much focused on communicating with the public. And let me say, we haven't really begun that. We're still learning and we're still testing and trying to figure out what are the best ways to do that before we begin engaging the public, which hopefully is not in the not so distant future.
Thank you, Chris. The next question is, the data you just showed publicly available, especially the data that showed the percentages and the different education levels?
Yes, if you go to, and more will be available. Only a little bit is available, and that is not by any kind of filter or screening. That simply has to do with bandwidth, and so much of this data is new. But I would direct folks to the ScienceCounts website, which is ScienceCounts, one word, .org. And if you go to the bottom of the homepage, you will actually see video of another talk I recently gave, which is similar to this at the Aspen Institute, which has many of these slides. You'll also be able to download the slide deck, which is similar to the slide deck I gave here. And so I would just, I think in the next 60 days, you'll find a lot more information will be posted on our website. That's our intent.
Okay, great, thank you. The next one is, what are the measures you use to calculate the socioeconomic status?
So I'm going to interpret that question, meaning, well, I'm trying to figure out how to interpret that question. So a socioeconomic status, for the sake of the data that I showed, we asked, it was a survey, it was a national survey, and in that survey, there's a section that's self-reporting data, where people, report on gender, age, etc. And in there was questions that had to do with what is your highest education level. And then there was also a question in terms of what is your, I think there were two, what was your income and what's your household income? So that's how we obtain SES.
Thank you. Then the next question is, the survey presented by education level and political affiliation, was it conducted only in the US or were there international respondents too?
Also, very good question. All of our work, ScienceCounts work, solely in the US. And that's just by design. That doesn't mean that everyone else doesn't matter, on the contrary. But this is a challenging area because cultural factors really matter. Because again, you're dealing with what people hope, what people think, their worldview. There's a lot of, it's very heterogeneous internationally. And so while we hope our learnings here have some benefit internationally, my sense is you kind of have to treat every case as its own case and make sure you take into effect sort of local and regional cultural issues and sensitivity. But everything here is solely the US.
Next question. Is there a way to promote industrial and academic scientists to communicate more and be more willing to work together?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that second part. I think it's really one question, but one of our cheers that we're trying to cheer as loud as possible is to acknowledge the fact that the private sector and industry has a vital role in this issue, and not just for for funding and support, but also perspective. Very often these types of initiatives like ScienceCounts come out of more of the academic side of the scientific community, and they don't really sort of form bridges with the private sector side. And we are trying very much, not to fall into that trap. We're very proud of the fact that we have significant, support from professional science, from academia, from philanthropy, and also from Johnson and Johnson and Elsevier, and talking with others. And we very much want to expand representation in all four of those sectors. But I think a balanced, inclusive approach to this problem that includes industry is important. Now, how to connect individual private sector scientists with academic scientists is somewhat more of at a tactical level than we operate. But actually, Radha, I sort of welcome if you wanted to share any thoughts about that, because to me that seems to align very much with what the Alda Center is about. Is not just to train, but to connect disparate groups of scientists together that otherwise wouldn't necessarily work together.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of been our experience too when we offer our workshops. At the end of it, depending on where and what fields these different scientists are from, it's incidental. Sometimes we feel we should be more intentional and explicit about it. Communities get formed, right, of people having the same vision and focus around science communication. And they do form their own sort of self-organized groups as a result of it. And we're looking to streamline those efforts, and that's something we'll start doing in a more systematic manner as we move forward on this. But that's a great question. Yeah. The next question is, what strategies have been most successful for changing people's views about the importance of climate change?
I think that's an open question. That is unresolved. There are a lot of folks working very hard on that. ScienceCounts is looking at promoting science in a more general sense, not necessarily, getting in the trenches with the 2 or 3 very contentious issues, climate change being one of them. But there are certainly groups that are working very hard on that issue. And I think it's fair to say progress is being made in understanding. And I think it's fair to characterize the progress of those groups as saying, you have to go down to a level, an individual or group level, where it matters, and start there. For example, in Southeast Florida, that is a place, and I know Dan Kahan, who I shared his data. I believe the name of his effort is Cultural Cognition, if I remember it right, group at Yale. They work very much tactically with citizens in Southeast Florida, both Republicans and Democrats, whose houses may be underwater here very shortly, and there's deep concern that goes past ideology at that point, because everybody's in the same boat, no pun intended. So I think we've learned that catchphrase, mottos, bumper stickers aren't the way to get real change. A real change has to engage at a community or an individual level, where there's enough alignment of substantive issues where you can build bridges. Okay.
Thank you. And the next question is, how can we more actively engage in continuous education to make us more effective communicators? I think, Chris, go ahead if you have any thoughts, but generally speaking, at the Alda Center, we've been trying out different ways to reach out to scientists out there who want to engage in science communication, to both people within their field and to fellow scientists and to the public at large there, right? And this webinar and webinars of this kind, and we also organize online workshops. So I think those are ways for you to also keep in touch and figure out the different strategies that you could be using to engage with the public. And Chris, did you want to add to that?
I don't think I can. I think that was perfect. I just want to say, which is what you just said, I am delighted to participate in this webinar as a guest because the Alda Kavli Learning Center, it's my understanding that that is very much the intent of this online presence, is to create all sorts of tools and resources to help people do that. So here we go.
Exactly. And online seems to be an effective way to reach out to larger numbers of people out there. So yes, please stay in touch and look out for what's next. Now, the next question, Chris, is what is the next step? Where do we go with this information? For example, if I want to persuade the public with respect to science's social impact, what do I do?
Yeah. Again, a great question and an open question. Speaking for ScienceCounts, we established at the beginning of this journey 3 years ago a trajectory, because ScienceCounts' origin very much came from scientists. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to, in essence, apply the scientific method to what is sort of a marketing campaign. And so we imagined for ourselves 3 stages. Stage 1 was to conduct research. And what you saw here was in essence the results of stage 1. It doesn't mean we know everything we need to know, but that was sort of our first plunge into the pool, and we learned a lot. Stage 2 was then to take some of these learnings and test them out and see if we could exactly do what the person who asked the question is. How do you actually put into practice these learnings? And so this time last year, we conducted a digital campaign where we tried a whole bunch of different ads in 5 locations around the country: rural Mississippi, Cincinnati, Orlando, Dallas, and Madison, Wisconsin. Had about 130 million impressions. So it was a conventional digital advertising campaign, both on web pages and in social media with Twitter and Facebook, to begin to see how, answer the how do you do this part. And so for the last couple of months, we've been digesting that data. I can tell you that it's hard. I can tell you that in our test, we missed the target a lot. A lot of what we tried didn't work. Not terribly surprised by that. We knew this would be a hard problem. I can tell you that we learned what are some really, really important components to, sort of making the argument for science's social impact. And at the front of that list, I would say the source or the messenger of the message. We live in such a skeptical and cynical society that the messenger, the credibility and the trustworthiness of the messenger is actually as important, if not more important, than the message itself. Because a great message delivered from an unreliable source is immediately thrown down the drain. So for me, operating at a strategic level, it's very important to say, if I want to reach a particular group that shares this value set, as an initial step, I've got to figure out who that group trusts as a source of information and guidance, and make a case to them and bring them on board. This is going to be very much a teamwork, effort. How to do that most effectively, et cetera, that's exactly where we are. That's exactly the kinds of questions we're trying to answer right now. And hopefully a year from now, we'll be much wiser. But we're very much in the middle of the how-to part of this, which is tough. But I am confident that we will succeed. We just have to remember, we live in a marketplace, not a classroom. This is not about preaching. This is about listening first and foremost.
Excellent. Okay. Next question. How do you reconcile the perception of hope with the strong negative communications around climate change consequences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my short, trite, not useful answer to that is go and talk to a really good oncologist, okay? Oncologists are people who are dealing with hopeless situations on a daily basis. And yet many of us, and myself included through family members, I have seen firsthand some of the most wonderful people and one of the most hopeful people, some of the most hopeful people in the form of oncologists in some of the most desperate situations. Just because we have a looming, major challenge before us doesn't mean that one can't then sort of deliver the bad news and then pivot to the good news. And we have to do that. And that's what we just haven't done very well as a community. And it's happening now more and more. Now, again, this is simple and it's easy to say, we're all doomed, but, chin up, we can do this. But that's what I'm here to tell you that the public wants from us. If you take a step back and look at all of the scientific issues that rub a measurable amount of the public the wrong way, climate change, evolution, GMOs, to a lesser degree vaccines, you will see in those cases situations where people see science as attacking what they hope for, hoping in a different arena, okay, not necessarily science. And so the challenge is that the brand of science is hope, and people want us to be hopeful, but that doesn't always mean that we give good news. We just can't. If a good scientist can't filter, you have to give the facts. So, but what it means is from a messaging point of view, you can deliver bad news and sometimes hopeless news, like an oncologist does, but somehow they find out a way to pull hope out of that situation. And that's what we need to do. That's what really effective science communicators need to figure out how to do. And let me say, it's known how to do that. I'm making it sound like a mystery. It's not. Again, folks like the Alda Center and others actually know how to do that. They can train people or help people do that. Empathy is a big, big part of it.
Next question. I'm a communications professional who works with scientists. What are some resources that I can use to help our scientists communicate their research with the public?
Rada, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna point that question to you because that's what you're an expert in that.
Even as I was reading that question, I was like, yes, that's precisely what the Alda Center works on. And we do, again, at the risk of sounding like we're marketing our own products here, the focus of all of our work has been how to bring science to the public, how to make it accessible to people who are not in this field, right? And there's a lot of interest and people do want to learn more about it. And as Chris pointed out earlier, there is this expectation, there is this aspirational sense and perception about science that people have, that, science is hope, is not just, a lip service on what we say it is, right? But it's actually giving people the tools that will help them connect with audiences. We've trained over 14,000 scientists on using face-to-face training approaches, and we've now expanded in a big way in the online space through the support from the Kavli Foundation. So that's definitely one way. And of course, there are other organizations and institutions that focus on science communication training. But the big piece that we are realizing for the last 8 to 10 years is there is an increased interest amongst the scientists and in that community to want to reach out to the public, to want to reach out to non-specialists. Yeah. So training that focuses on empathy, training that focuses on what Chris highlighted, which is really deep and authentic listening, even not just about what the public has to say, but also about what your fellow scientists have to say. Just even listening to all of that, listening across the aisle. I think these are important pieces and a first step towards building that empathy, which is much needed, much needed when it comes to being an effective communicator. Yeah. And the next question, my God, we're getting so many questions.
And I'll try to shorten my answers so we can get everybody in. So,
sure.
Yeah.
So let's see. So if some of the questions sound redundant, Chris, it's because I'm not able to keep up with the speed here at which we're getting. Okay, how would you classify the expected outcome of today's talk? Is it information or persuasion?
Well, it's information. If you're a science communicator or you're already sort of further along on this issue. It's persuasion. I would say the one piece of persuasion is change your reference frame. That again, we're not in a classroom lecturing one way to a community of folks who chose to be there. That we have to compete. We are in a competitive world with the Western society is a society of consumers, of decision makers. People don't want to be told what to do. They want to opt in. And so either we play that game or we don't play that game. We can lament that game, but that's the game. And I think we absolutely have to play that game. And because we have we have an intrinsically valuable, piece of a healthy society. I mean, science, has transformed the world in 100 years. It isn't morally good. It's sort of a hammer. It can be used for good or bad, but as a net, it's been used to do remarkable things. And I think, there's a moral obligation for those of us who care about science and scientists when the opportunity presents itself to take advantage of that. So that's a good question. I would say, depends on who my audience is, but I've walked the line between persuasion and boosting literacy.
Next question. You spoke about science as a brand in general. When scientists are working on specific issues, how would you recommend creating a more specific brand to facilitate public communication?
Right. So what a brand means is it gives you insight sort of at a very high level of what the expectations are of your audience from the very moment you begin to interact with them. So it's sort of that initial condition. Where you take it from there is up to you. You can build on it or you can work against it if you have to. It's hard. It's generally not advised, but you can. It's up to you. So when I say, again, this is very important, please don't confuse branding with the tactical parts of building a message. When I say science is hope, I'm talking about sort of the general sense of the ecosystem. That doesn't mean every third word you use is hope, or you only deliver good news and you hide the bad stuff. No, but it's sort of saying what the initial expectation is. And then the question is, how do I make this big idea, small enough it fits into my world? Again, people look to scientists. It's not just science, but it's scientists as delivering hopeful news and curiosity. And you remember those words on the slide: discovery, youth, optimism, invention, exploration. These are the words that people associate with science and scientists. And so to the extent one can incorporate those into your language when communicating, you're not going to have resistance. You're going to be more successful. Let me just say this: you got to talk benefits. Even it doesn't mean that, hey, this is, I'm studying phytoplankton in this little, part of the ocean, it's going to change your life. I'm not advocating that we sort of whip up, false narratives, but you do want to make some kind of connection with people. And that connection may just be, hey, you're always looking for something new to learn. Here's a bit of really interesting trivia. Because there are people who generally, like to learn new stuff. It doesn't have to be transforming. So you kind of have to pick your battles. But you want to talk about benefits. You don't want to get into technical details first. That's something that we as scientists do backwards. When you write a scientific paper, the most interesting things tend to come at the end of the paper in the conclusion section. All the other words is sort of setting the stage. That is not how the real world works. If you don't get something interesting out of your mouth in the first 2 or 3 sentences, you've lost them. They've moved on. It's sort of, basic sales 101. So put the interesting stuff on the front and then let them tease out the details. That's kind of the ideal arrangement. I hope that's helpful.
If I may add to that, Chris, I think there's something to say about doing science and being a scientist versus communicating science, right? And the audiences, I think it's important to let your audience know what's in it for them, or so what, why should they even care about this? And that might very well be something that you're doing for the greater good, right? It does not have to be a direct so what for them in that moment. So that's something to think about as well.
Excellent point.
And the next question, this seems straightforward and I should be able to answer this. How can I pass this webinar on to colleagues at my university in Alaska? A recording of this webinar will be available by no later than mid next week. So please look out, go back and look at our website. You should have access to it, and we'll also do our bit to get the word out there as soon as it's uploaded. Yeah. Okay, the next question then is, how do we respond to lay people whose hopes for science are unrealistic? For example, although I'm amazed by the number of cancers that are now treatable, my mother is angry that there is not yet a singular cure for cancer. Her disappointment does affect her voting behaviors.
Yeah, well, managing expectations is a whole nother 2 webinars unto themselves, right? That's a great question. That's a challenging problem. And I'm trying to think of giving anything useful in 2 or 3 sentences. I mean, that's a problem, but that's a good problem to have, because as I would read that problem, it's a kinetic problem. In other words, someone wants a desired outcome that we as scientists want as well. They're just impatient that it's taking too long to get it. And so that's someone with a lot of energy, potentially, that maybe can do something. And I'm going to use the cliche, write to your congressman and say, hey, I actually maybe can have a role in speeding things up a little bit if, we fund more, research. And again, we all know there's not it's not a one-to-one correlation between spending money and getting, innovating. It doesn't quite exactly work that way. But, it's a tough question, but that's actually, as someone who's trying to activate people in the public to say, hey, I want, I want more science and more benefits from science. That's the kind of person actually that makes me kind of get up in the morning and do this. We just have to find a way for that person to channel what feels like a bit of powerlessness and hopelessness from their particular perspective, to channel it into a way of maybe actually doing something that then can turn some of the levers and actually, ramp up the folks who are working on the problem. And I don't want to say it's just about money. I mean, it could be just like, hey, the next crop of scientists that are in high schools right now, we need more of them. It could be workforce development. It could be many things. So good question that I didn't give a good answer to, but well, I'll stop there.
The next question is, what role do you think the media has played in lowering the trust in science, if any? Let me explain. Scientific studies come out, but they get sensationalized or misrepresented by the media.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem, and it's a problem that we have essentially no control over, because the media does what the media does. And just to separate sort of media versus journalists, I would say, for me, one of the most valuable things in terms of coming out with that umbrella of all the different types of science communication was to lay out visually what I had experienced as a young scientist when I would give an interview, and I was in the mindset of boosting science literacy. I thought that the reporter wanted to learn everything about my research, and here I am, young and naive, and giving them all the nuances and why my research is so exciting. And then I would read the article that came out. It was one sentence that was sort of, in my opinion, overgeneralized. And then the next sentence was someone with a counterpoint. And I was like, whoa, I felt like betrayed by my marketing department. Well, it was very unfair for me to put that journalist in that position, because that's not their job. Their job is to inform. And the way they often do that is they show 2 sides to a story. The media, and we'll talk about sort of the corporation that is the media, the mass media, I mean, they thrive. The way they get people to pay attention is to be sensationalist. So that's how they survive. So to expect them not to be sensationalists, I don't think is a fair expectation. But I agree that it's not productive for us, and it sets false. This goes back to the previous question. It sets false expectations for how quickly or not quickly we can make progress. And we just kind of have to deal with it. And the way you deal with it is you just kind of make a counterpoint. Hopefully your next door neighbor trusts you as a neighbor who's a scientist or a science communicator that engages with them, just talks to them while mowing the lawn, than they do, a 10-second blurb that they watch on a cable channel that is sort of spit out at them. So again, I would answer the question, it's a competitive information environment. We have to go out there and we have to be present and fight. It's kind of the short answer.
Yeah. Does the data show differences based on age or
Yes.
exposure to science at young ages?
Yes, it does. And gender. And not our data. There's not a lot of data in terms of ethnicity, but there's enough. And I mean, it would be shocking if there weren't differences in ethnicity as well. But age in our data set and gender, yes. And so, for example, with the charts that we looked at, what would we look at? Environment, national defense, health, and disabled, right? So generally speaking, older folks see, this is not going to be a huge surprise, disabled and healthcare issues more intensely than younger folks. But younger folks are not oblivious. They feel strongly too, but just not as strong. So you're talking, 90% versus 75%. Women tend to be much more in tune with sort of social issues. For example, I'm going to call healthcare as one. I'm going to call the disabled as one. Education as one. Women also tend to be more sensitive to the environment by a little bit. Men tend to be, some of the charts I didn't show, tend to be, see a greater urgency with regards to kind of economic competitiveness, national defense, space exploration, which I didn't show, is a big one in terms of a gender difference. It is definitely the go-to for more men than women as far as something that is an urgent scientific activity or endeavor. So gender and age, and the age, the bias has to do a lot with health and disability. I would say, if you ask me what's one thing that younger folks feel more strongly about, there's definitely a spike with younger women when it comes to the role of science in improving education. So not science education, but the role of scientific research in improving how we educate our children. That's one example of where younger women in particular, sort of lead the pack, which I'll let everyone, kind of connect the dots on that one.
And related to that question, in fact, part 2 of that question is it a myth that if children are exposed to science at a young age, that they are more apt to supporting science as adults?
Yeah, so that's outside my range of expertise. I can't speak to that. And I'm trying to think who could. I think the jury's still out. I'm not sure enough time has elapsed in that natural social experiment. Kind of science communication and these issues, sort of have modernized in only the last couple decades. I'm not dismissing what was done before then, but it was done through a different lens. Let me also say that, people who grew up during the Great Depression and World War II definitely had to have a different perspective on many things with regards to science than millennials today. People who grow up in an environment where there's tremendous need and suffering see science much more as a solution to needs. One of the biggest concerns we have collectively is millennials and younger generations now who have not known broadly those societal needs. It's very clear from our data as others that society is becoming much more apathetic towards the need in science in society and the need for scientific research. Let me just give 2 statistics that I didn't share here. One is 50% of Americans, and this is across ideology and this is across SES, it's very broad. 50% of Americans believe that if the United States lost its leading role in STEM worldwide, it would have no impact on their lives. Think about that for a second, okay? The other statistic that makes people like me very nervous, who are close to policymakers, is that only 1 in 4 Americans believe that the role of the federal government in funding science is necessary. Okay, 3 out of 4 Americans believe that if the federal government were to stop funding science, life would be okay. Now, let me tell you why they believe that, because I don't want that could be scary for people who are getting federal grants. The why is the perception is that private sector corporations, philanthropy, and people like Elon Musk do most of the research in the United States. That's the perception. So that if the federal government were to leave the business, while that's not good news, that's not so tragic because those other 3 sectors could easily fill the gap. The reason that's so dangerous is for those of us who know the numbers, at least somewhere around 50 to 60% of funding for basic research in the United States directly comes from the federal government. So if that goes away, there is no way corporate America, philanthropy, and Elon Musk are going to go broke filling that gap. It's too big a hole. So that's something that's very concerning in terms of perception. So science is being taken for granted is sort of the short message.
So in the interest of time, I think you can take one more question. Okay. I'm going to pick one from the list I have here. How do we convince population that vaccines really don't cause autism? We're already using marketing techniques as best as we can, focusing on an empathetic messenger, but it's clearly not working quickly now.
Yeah. Good question. And again, I'm probably going to reveal the fact that I'm not an expert in that specific issue, but I'm going to say something as a non-expert, and please, everyone should feel free to dismiss it. First of all, in terms of the anti-vax community, it's really actually a very small community. It's on the order of maybe 2%, maybe 3% of the population, according to national surveys done by others that I have seen. That doesn't mean that it's something we should ignore, but it's not like 20% of Americans. So just one thing. The other thing is that issue, like GMOs, and like climate change. Let me say this: I happen to live in North Texas. Okay, I wasn't born here, but I live in North Texas. I live in a place where I think it's fair to say most of my neighbors are would be called climate deniers, using that term. If you take them aside privately, where no one's listening, they acknowledge that climate change is happening, and that for the most part is probably man-made. All right, you throw enough trash in your backyard, sooner or later it piles up. They get that. Their resistance in acknowledging it publicly has a fear that has nothing to do with science. It's that if they acknowledge it and roll over, as they would say, they give permission to Al Gore, Nancy Pelosi, and others to completely change their lifestyle, to take away their truck, to make them stop using the air conditioning when it's 100 degrees in the summer. People who fly around in private jets and have chauffeurs will suddenly tell them, you can't do this anymore. It's a bit like gun control. So the issue is not scientific, it's larger societal. And I think that's what you're talking about when you're talking about vaccines. On the left, it's a fear of corporations, the evil pharma, that either because they're lazy or sloppy or manipulative are trying to hurt our kids. On the right, because vax actually, it's a fringe on both ends of the spectrum. On the right, it's sort of, it's a fear of control. Government control, don't tell me what to do. GMOs are the same way, although GMOs actually it's more of a left concern, and it has to do with the idea of artificial versus natural and synthetic, and it appeals to those sensibilities. So the answer to the person's question is a good one. I mean the question is good. I don't have an answer, but I would say it's not about science. So if you're trying to use science to persuade, scientific data to persuade, you're probably going to fail. It is about other things that are other value sets that people are pulling from. And so that's where you have to engage them. So it may be very non-scientific conversations.
Excellent. And Chris, basically, you have 1 or 2 minutes for any closing comments, and then I can tell people what's next.
Terrific. I won't take 1 or 2 minutes. I just want to thank everybody for their time on this Friday afternoon, their attention. I hope this was useful. This is a very, very complicated issue. As you heard, a lot of good questions for which I didn't give a lot of good answers because we're still trying to figure it out. But what I'm here to say, what I think is really good news, is the fact that we've actually answered some of the big questions. And that branding question, knowing that most Americans equate science with hope, is fundamental. Because if you were running a company and you had a product and you didn't know your brand and you start advertising, communicating, boy, you're really going in the dark. And there's lots of good examples of that. Harley Davidson does not sell motorcycles. That is not the brand of Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson's brand is freedom with attitude. That's why you buy a Harley Davidson. You want to express that value set. And that's how we have to start thinking in the scientific community. We have to understand why people, what people look to us to provide, which is hope, and then do our best from a situation to a situation basis to deliver. And that may be cures to cancer. That may be simply appealing to intellectual curiosity about some remote organism they've never heard about before. Tactically, everyone sort of has to pick and choose where they are, but it helps to know where at least the starting point is. So thank you. And if you have any other questions about my work specifically, and it's not answered here on the learning, the Learning Center as it develops, please feel free to, my email is my last name. Actually, it's probably easier to do it this way. Just say info@sciencecounts.org, and I will do my best to get back to you and we'll start a dialogue. Thank you so much, Radha.
Yeah. So I'm seeing all these responses on chat that says, thank you. This was great. Very informative. Thanks so much. So Chris, truly it was informative and a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for doing this. And I want to thank all the participants, and please feel free to send us an email, and we'll be happy to. And I hope some of you, or at least all of you, selected to receive our emails and to be part of our newsletter subscription list. So thank you, and check out our website for upcoming webinars and other things. And I do want to leave you all with one of Alan's quotes that I really, really like. Communication is not something you add on to science. It is the essence of science. And I think that's quite a powerful quote and something for us all to think about. So thank you for your time. And with that, we'll close today's webinar.